Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a fun video that is dedicated to my Patreons. And today I am going to be reacting to my Patreon's favourite fantasy book of all time. I've been wanting to do a video like this for a while and finally managed to get a poll out to my Patreons. I adore my Patreons. They are the best Patreons on the planet. I'm sure every creator says that, but genuinely mine are. Like, they are just the loveliest bunch of people, and I speak to these people pretty much on a daily basis and they bring so much joy to my life, and I'm very, very grateful to have them in my life for many reasons, but one of them being that we have this shared obsession and love for books. And so I wanted to do a video kind of reacting to their favourite fantasy books. In my request, I asked them to obviously give the name and title of the book or series, to pick one specific book within a series if they could, who their favourite character in the book is, and also if there are any other books or series that they would recommend to other people if they like this particular book or series. So I'm going to go through each one. I have 5 of my Patrons to go through. So with that in mind, let's kick off with Cheryl. So Cheryl said, my favourite fantasy series is the First Law series. I love the Age of Madness series too. It's tough to choose between the two of them. My favourite book of this series is The Last Argument of Kings. Now, as many of you know who watch my channel, you'll know that I absolutely love The First Law by J. Abercrombie. It is also one of my favourite series of all time. Cheryl clearly is a person of taste, and my favourite one was actually Best Served Cold. But in retrospect, I think Last Argument of Kings is incredibly masterful just because of how Abercrombie is able to tie all of the pieces together just in that one book, because there are so many pieces and threads open in book 2. And book 3 isn't significantly larger than, say, like book 1 or book 2, but he's able to tie everything up in a way that is super satisfactory, and I do think that is a huge achievement. Let's continue. The way Joe Abercrombie pulls everything together, we agree. I should have kept reading. His use of literary irony and savage realism absolutely leaves you breathless. I couldn't agree more. His characters are so well written by the end of the series, they are your friends. I also couldn't agree more. A lot of these characters are very morally grey. Some of them, you know, they do some pretty messed up things, but despite all of that, you are rooting for them. You want them to succeed in their mission, and they're characters that you actually begin to miss once you finish that initial trilogy. As it relates to characters, dear God, I wouldn't want to be any of these characters. They all have such brutal arcs. If I had to choose, I guess I would pick R.D. West. She has a bit of happiness. Yeah, that's true. R.D. does get a bit of happiness by the end of it. That is a very tough question, actually, I think, as it relates to First Law, because none of them have a particularly good time. So yeah, so that is a pretty difficult question. I guess Bayaz, if I had to pick, I'd probably pick Bayaz just because he kind of comes out on top because of who he is. But I mean, he's a really evil guy, so I'm not sure actually. And then in terms of recommendations for people who also like this series, Cheryl recommends The Long Press Quartet by Daniel Abraham. Similar realism and great characters, but not as much humour, and I couldn't agree more. I've also given this recommendation to First Law fans. Definitely give The Long Press Quartet a go. I would say there are some similar elements in terms of the story, but I think for me, Long Press Quartet is almost akin to military fantasy by the time that you get to like book 2 and book 3. Whereas I think there is obviously an element of military fantasy in the First Law, but I wouldn't say it's as pivotal to the story as it is for the Long Press Quartet. The only other thing that I will say, which I 100% agree with Cheryl on, is that there is not much humour in the Long Press Quartet. Like, I would say Long Press Quartet is darker in many ways than the First Law, just in terms of its realism, whereas I think sometimes Abercrombie borders on absurdism, which is partly what makes these books so enjoyable. So Cheryl, I agree with everything you've said. And now we have Michael, and Michael says, I thought about this for a while. Obviously fantasy isn't my primary focus. Michael reads a lot of classics and translated fiction. I loved the first trilogy of the First Law last year, but haven't read the rest. I liked Tolkien when I read him a quarter century ago. Both perfectly respectable choices, but then it came to me, his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and its continuation, The Book of Dust. I'm going to just pause it there and then I'll continue on with the rest of his paragraph. So agreed, First Law is very much a reasonable option, and obviously Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, very much a reasonable option. I think that's a lot of people's kind of entryway into fantasy, and it is a cult classic for a reason. His Dark Materials, so I've only read the first 2 books of His Dark Materials, and I read them when I was younger. I think I was like in my early teens, and I remember that I really enjoyed them when I was reading them, and I really liked actually how gritty the books were, because I think His Dark Materials is actually quite a bit darker than people realise. There are some like genuinely quite upsetting parts in that series. I never finished it. I don't know why. I think possibly because at the time that I was reading this series, I was also really getting into classics, and I think that's where my love for classics really began. And so possibly just deprioritize it for that reason. But I really should finish it at some point, though I do know what happens at the end of the trilogy. But it was very, very solid, I think. Let's continue. Are both the film and series adaptations abominations? Yes. But can I resist a modern rewriting of Blake's writing of Milton? No. The books were treated as YA when they came out. Yeah, they absolutely were. I remember when they were marketed. I remember my school teachers talked about them, so they were very much YA. I have to assume this was for marketing reasons. They are packed with allusions to ancient and Renaissance texts and ideas, modern astrophysics, and other such arcana. They're also really dark. That's what I just touched on. I remember feeling genuinely wounded when I closed the amber spyglass the first time I read it in 2001. So that feels like the right answer, and I hope it's a slightly less common one. Yeah, I do remember them being very dark, and I do remember them having lots of kind of like physicsy parallels. Like there's a lot of physics in that series that, as somebody who loves science, particularly physics, it really kind of scratched that itch. I actually really want to pick it up now. Michael has made me want to pick it up, give it a reread from the start, and then maybe give some thoughts at the end. I don't know, is anybody interested in me reading it, and would anybody potentially be interested in joining me for it? Because I think that could be really fun to do that as like a channel read. But let's see, let me know down below. If I could be anyone in this series, Yorick Bernison, probably. I don't remember Yorick Bernison. To be honest with you, I don't really remember many of the characters apart from the main character, Lyra, because the other thing about that series is that a big part of it is set in Oxford, which I've said in one of my previous videos. That's where I was born and raised. It's also where I spend a lot of my time, even today. I remember when I was at school, the setting was like something that we talked about actively because it was set like not that far from my school. What would I recommend to people who like this series? Paradise Lost, Blake's longer poems. At this point, your viewers will call for my death, but I'm totally serious. The series takes its title from a line in Paradise Lost. Ah, I had no idea, and I really need to read Paradise Lost, and now you've given me another reason to do so, Michael. But if you want a very different fantasy series woven from similar mythic materials, perhaps I might mention John Crowley's Egypt Cycle, which I have on my list and I really want to read. All right, next we have Matt. I finally settled on Little Big by John Crowley. I could recommend several of his novels that I've loved. The Egypt Cycle, about a point in your life of great change where anything is possible and the choices we make. I'm going to probably butcher some of these words, so please bear with me. Kardar Oakley is the ruin of Emir, about a crow who stole immortality from the human underworld, telling the story of life at the end of the world. It's Little Big though. That stands out as Crowley's masterpiece. Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing. I definitely need to check out John Crowley stuff. I think I will probably start off with the Egypt Cycle and then some of his other stuff, but I will also check out Little Big. This book is indescribable, a splendid madness, or a delightful sanity, or both. Persons who enter this book are advised that they will leave it in a different size than when they came in. A book that all by itself calls for a redefinition of fantasy. And that is a quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my favourite authors, and I've talked about her many times on this channel. Smokey Barnable is on his way to Edgewood to be married as was prophesied. This novel is about the tale, the lives of this family over several generations that live on the edge of magic in a house that seems to grow and change, bigger on the inside than the outside. A fairy world just out of sight, hidden away. It's about their love and loss, the nature of belief and history. It's a book that will grow with you as you read it, make you feel as if there is magic if you can just catch a glimpse of it. Crowley's writing is prose poem. Oh my gosh, that sounds like such a wonderful description of this book, and now I want to pick up Little Big. So well done, Matt. You've made me want to pick it up sooner rather than later. I can imagine myself as Smokey, a normal man swept up in this magic, not overt magic, but a destiny of love promised to him, of belonging and understanding, the kind of magic that infuses life if we look for it. It's a comforting fantasy you wish to be real. That sounds absolutely wonderful, and I really, really want to pick it up now. I like the idea of like cozy magic. It's about a normal guy kind of being exposed to a foreign world. I love that stuff. A similar book that comes to mind is Always 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I think it has a similar magical realism and a sweeping view of a family in a special place. Susanna Clarke says Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was inspired by it. Wow, I had no idea. And Lud in the Must by Hope Merles is often compared. Patricia McKillip would belong nicely in this company as well. Wow, absolutely amazing. I feel like Matt should get a job in marketing because he really sold that. I'm curious if anybody has actually read The Egypt Cycle or Little Big, because I actually think it was one of you who recommended The Egypt Cycle to me, and it's been on my list now for about a year or two. So let me know if there are any other John Crowley fans down below, because I feel like there's probably a few. Okay, let's head to Mandy next. So I am going for the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, even though it is quite some time since I completed it. I chose it as I'm not the biggest fantasy reader, but I was engrossed so much with this series that I didn't read much else at the time. Fair enough. I mean, it's like a 10, 12 book series. It's crazy long. My favourite of the series has to be Dark Tower 7, which is the last in the series. It is difficult to say much without spoilers, but there are a couple of things that happen in this book that I still think about. Some people have a problem with the ending of the series, but I think it ended perfectly and there isn't anything I would change about it. I was very careful while reading to avoid spoilers about the end. There is a huge wiki about Dark Tower that sometimes I needed to visit if I was confused about something, but I would advise anyone reading for the first time to tread carefully and definitely stay off Reddit threads, etc., as there will be people whinging about certain plot points. So a couple of things there. So I really want to read Dark Tower. It's a series that I've heard generally only really good things about, and I've heard generally only really good things about the ending. There are a few people who have grumbles with how certain things panned out, but overwhelmingly, at least in what I've seen, people like the ending and they say it's an absolutely amazing series that has really good consistency. And Mandy and I have very similar tastes. To be fair, I have very similar tastes to all my Patreons. So the fact that I know she loves it, and then there's a couple of other people in the Patreon who also really like Dark Tower, I have a feeling that I'm also going to really love it as well, because I have heard it is very dark. As it relates to spoilers and things like that, very useful tip, because this is a very like well-known series. Obviously it's Stephen King, so it's going to be, but always good to have a word of warning about potential spoilers online and avoiding, you know, looking at wikis and Reddits and things like that, because we wouldn't want to accidentally see something that we shouldn't. Let's continue. I wouldn't want to be any character from the series, as none of them get away lightly without a lot of suffering. I suppose I could be Blaine the Mono, as it would be fun to be an insane train. What? That sounds so random, but what? Is there sentient objects in Dark Tower? If so, that is really cool. Sentient objects is like one of my favourite tropes in any genre of fiction, but particularly you see it in sci-fi and fantasy. That sounds wild. And also, similar to Cheryl, I get it. You don't want to necessarily be a character because they all go through so much pain and suffering. Other books I would recommend, I think it is fairly obvious, it would be other King works, especially those connected to the Dark Tower involving the Crimson King, like Insomnia and Hearts in Atlantis. The Stand also has connections, but not as obviously. Some people argue that the Dark Tower isn't fantasy and is more horror, but we don't listen to them. Indeed, we don't, Mandy. It always comes up in fantasy lists. I think it's probably one of those series that kind of crosses genres, and that's absolutely fine. And last but most certainly not least, we have James. Over a couple of days, I debated back and forth between two books, but ultimately decided my favourite fantasy book is The Hobbit by Tolkien. A lot of people would say The Lord of the Rings is the better book, but controversially, I've always thought it's The Hobbit. When I think of The Hobbit, I'm always amazed at what Tolkien produced in under 400 pages. That I'm going on an adventure wasn't just an adventure for Bilbo, but for the readers. That is so beautifully put. I read The Hobbit probably about 10 years ago, but it's still a book that I remember. It gave me that feeling that I was going on an adventure with the character, which I don't typically get a lot regardless of what I read, never mind fantasy specifically. Tolkien does really make you feel like you're a part of that journey. It feels cozy, it feels like you're in on it, and it is really delightful to read. Tolkien took a story that was so vast and detailed but covered so much of Middle-earth and created something the length of which he did. That's just the world he created. Bilbo and the Dwarfs alone would have probably been enough for a lot of authors, but he gave us so much more with the other hobbits, elves, and human characters. Whether you look at it from the perspective of the number of characters or the depth and care he took to create each one, with most of them having their own personalities, quirks, and styles. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, it's a very extensive character list. It's a very extensive world. And it doesn't feel like Tolkien is just throwing these things in to add kind of depth or bloat, I should say, to the story. He really pays attention to each one, and it really adds to that level of intimacy that I just don't think you get with a ton of adventure fantasy these days. Let's keep going. His vast world and characters alone were a feat, and he managed to do all this while still giving his cast of main characters their own room to breathe and develop, amongst which I would argue are three of the most recognisable and memorable characters in fantasy. We have Bilbo, Smeagol, and Smaug, two of which set the stage for something much larger to follow. Absolutely. Bilbo, Smeagol, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent Smaug, just because I think about the impact of the movies as well. Like, I think just people who don't even read fantasy will know of Bilbo and Smeagol Gollum in some way. Whereas Smaug maybe less so, just because I don't think the Hobbit films were as popular as the Lord of the Rings films. But I mean, even Smaug, his actions have lasting consequences on the broader world. I couldn't agree more. Like, we have some very, I hate using this word because it's so overused these days, but we have some very iconic characters in this IP that have continued to stand the test of time, and that I think will continue to stand the test of time. Let's finish off James's last bit. So we have a well-detailed world, an array of characters, and a story to back it up with all the facets you could ever want in an adventure, but jam-packed into something under 400 pages. Is The Lord of the Rings an epic 1,200-page masterpiece? And The Hobbit is equally so, but I feel it's much more accessible to beginners, and this will truly set the stage for their own adventures on their reading journey. And that is also really beautifully put. I couldn't agree more. I think this is a really good beginner fantasy for the exact reasons that James said. It's very approachable. The cast of characters is large enough that it feels like a sweeping epic, but it's intimate enough. You get to know each of these characters really well that it feels really intimate, and you miss them when you're not reading them, which is so lovely. It's funny, I've never really thought about the length of The Hobbit, but now that James has brought that to the kind of top of what he was saying, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is a 400-page book. It's absurdly short, and yet the amount that Tolkien was able to pack into that book is insane. It is absolutely insane. It's a standalone fantasy book that really sets the stage for this incredibly complex and beautiful and vivid world that is Middle-earth. And he's absolutely right. It is just so much more than what you maybe initially think. And I think also for a lot of people who began their journey not into just reading generally, but also into fantasy specifically, probably started off with a Tolkien book. At least my generation, I think that definitely applies to, and I definitely think older generations as well. Younger generations probably not, because they're too busy reading Fourth Wing, which is very worrying in itself. So I couldn't agree more. Wow, this was not as controversial as I thought it was going to be, because it's funny how the people who are my Patreons are people who I do have very similar taste to, and that is probably partly why they are my Patreons, and partly why we all kind of not necessarily get on so well, because I think you can get on really well with people who you also have different reading tastes to. But I think one of the things that I've noticed in my Discord is that we all have like really great discussions about books, and I think it's because a lot of our interests really align in terms of the genres and subgenres that we consume. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that this was super positive and that none of their opinions were particularly controversial to me, but I am really curious if any of their opinions and my opinions as an extension of that are controversial to you. So let me know down below in the comments whether you agree with my wonderful Patreons and also my added little thoughts. Let me know as well down below in the comments the answers to the questions that I asked my Patreons. You know, what is your favorite fantasy book or series of all time? Why is it your favorite? If you could be a character from this book or series, which character would you be and why? And then what other books or series would you recommend to others who also love the series that you've chosen? Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you liked this one. And I also just want to say a huge thank you to my Patreons. I adore you. And I'm very privileged to have you all in my little Books with Zara community. You guys literally don't realize how much you are like my saving grace sometimes, because the world is crazy and life is busy, and yet I can always count on my patrons being in Discord chatting about books. There's something very comforting about that. So thank you for everything that you do, for participating in this video, for supporting my channel, and thank you everybody else for also continuing to support, and I really hope to see your comments down below. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I will see you in my next one.